Great. Well, I know many of you are hoping for a full disclosure on how to do parliamentary procedures from your current and former speaker here. That's not tonight, folks. We want to go through instead and develop our tips based on 10 questions that you may ask yourself as a meeting chair, a member, and executive staff director. Well, this is the first of a series of the Leadership Roadshow for components. There are definitely correlations that you may utilize for your dental office team meetings or even those for outside of the dental field. Engaging and communicating more with dental team members is something that we'll explore in our annual session webinar on communication. So go through, make sure to sign up for that as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we always have to look at with our tips is, let's be clear, you should know why you are meeting. So as we say here, the reason or cause for a meeting. Do I have a clear meeting objective? The questions you're going to want to ask about it. Is the meeting really necessary? Do your bylaws for your component or your group require that you have the meeting? Is there enough on the agenda to warrant an in-person meeting, or could you do it electronically, just as we're doing now, as we have been doing now for almost 11 months? The one thing you've got to also keep a track of here is that there are certain restrictions to business via email that may be counterproductive to your organization and the business at hand. Now, if the content is purely informational with no feedback that you need immediately, can a video or written report accomplish the goals? That's the big part. Is it informational? Just be able to read it and move on and do something else. And last, what are you really trying to accomplish from the meeting?
So that brings up the next point, and the best meetings are those where the best decisions are made. As a comment that I wrote, it's in your House of Delegate manual years ago, and it's just a paraphrase of standard code. So keep in mind that even if a meeting is for the sole purpose of information delivery, you need that in order to provide an avenue for future work, because the best decisions may occur as a result of how you deliver that information or that data. But again, we want to emphasize this: no decision needs to be made or direction given or affirmation of the goal of a report. The question again, is my meeting necessary, or do I want to consider an alternate route? One of my favorite small business or business authors that writes his books in fables is Patrick Lencioni. And he says, the majority of meetings should be discussion that lead to decision. Which brings me to a story I want to share with you. When I was a moderator of our church council, which is like chair of our church council, I was faced with something very similar and a frustrating issue. Our bylaws were clear that we had to hold monthly meetings to review the business of the church, church reports, financial reports, pastoral news, committee reports. However, very little business transpired in the summer, especially during the month of July. No committees met. It wasn't burdensome to look at our financials in a 2-month window. We certainly utilized email and communication, and he even brought him into the Zoom fold a little bit towards the end of my tenure there. But I became frustrated with having to have a meeting just because it was required. So our action was amend our bylaws. So we took that back, and by doing that one little change, we increased volunteerism. People showed up because they knew that when they had to be there, we were going to be productive. We weren't going to waste their time. So I ask you, do you have that necessary flexibility to hold meetings only when necessary? Understanding and accomplishing this first question of, do I have a clear meeting objective, is the necessary first step, which leads us to the next tip. Todd?
Right, preparation. This is the big part for both Deb and I. We grew up in sports as well, and preparation is always the key to success within that. Within preparation, have you taken the necessary steps for the meeting? Did you develop an agenda and distribute it prior to the meeting? Preferably this should be sent with the meeting invitation. When you leave your last meeting, set up the time for the next meeting. I know for our component here locally, we set up the whole year. I know Kalamazoo Valley and others do that, and they keep everything all set for the year. So there is a standard time that they meet. But when you set that meeting invitation out, that agenda should go. There's nothing worse than showing up and nobody knows what they're going to do. If that regular meeting, there's agenda topics will create an interest and might improve the attendance at that meeting for what people are seeing there as well. Other parts that you could use for when you're going through to select when you're going to meet, SurveyMonkey. If you need help with this, there's folks at Michigan Dental that do SurveyMonkeys all the time to go through and poll people rather than sending out an email and everyone replying separately. I know for trying to pick dates, that was a good way to do that as well for back when COVID, when people didn't have their emails all rolling as well. Confirm that people are showing up, folks. This is no different than our offices. Confirm who's going to be there. You want to make sure that you're going to be able to take the votes that you need to take as well. There's always a clear attendance policy, which will help making sure that members attend. I know for some boards, it might say that you need to have a certain percentage of attendance in order to remain on that board. But you want to make sure people are there. But most importantly, with this preparation, it shows that it's important for those members to be there, and it gives them a reason why. Otherwise, if you're not prepared, they're not prepared, and the meeting is not going to be as successful as you would like. And again, one thing to also check on, will there be any guests? Do you have anybody arriving? Have you invited a member of the Board of Trustees to be, if it is virtual or in person, if they'll be attending, letting them know for what you'd like them to speak on. If you have somebody coming in, let's say from the local, who knows, the local dental assisting program coming in, what time can they arrive so they know that they can be participating in that meeting? And that's a big thing to be ready for sure on that. We'll keep going. Develop a program to go through and onboard new and returning members. Now, I'll tell you one thing for me, when I returned back to the board here 4 years ago as speaker, the culture was different in regards to onboarding. I can look back and tell you that 19 years ago, when I first came on the board, here was about the level of onboarding. There's your chair. You find your name tag, you go sit down, and that's where you're starting from. There might have been a little conversation beforehand, but truth be told, it was 19 years ago. I don't remember it. Now I know that every year for our new and our returning board members for Michigan Dental Association, we do a full 8 to 4, 9 to 4 day where we go through and it goes through the steps of the board. There is some repetition each year, but you know what? That's a good thing. It breeds familiarity and we know what to expect. And the one part for me is that's just a good way to get together, a good start to that new year that we have in June following the House of Delegates meeting and the votes. But the difference from 19 years ago till now is night and day, and that culture is completely different. And for me, it sure makes it a nice way to get to know the new folks. You might have known them, but you see them in a different light, and you start to work collaboratively right from the get-go. And that is one thing that I know for our local component, trying to bring folks in with new people joining, where they reset the board this year. Almost 2/3 was new board members coming in. And that was a good way, at least to get a starting point. You won't get to know everybody, especially by Zoom, as a challenge. But that's one thing to do. But for me, that board orientation now, if you want to find out how to do a board orientation right, get a hold of Karen Burgess, pick her brain on this one for ideas, or talk to, give Debra a call or a text, and that's great by us for sure. We know that most components, more than 50%, do not have an orientation program. But here's the next part. Members will participate more readily and fully if they understand the process. So how you do things. A little bit of history is a good thing. So many are confused and intimidated by the formality of parliamentary process. I don't know about you all, but that's how it started for me. That 20 some years ago, I didn't know what a motion was. You just sat there and you voted and that was it. But learning those basics and talking about how are things done here, whether it's your church board or your dental society board or your staff meeting, your team meetings that you have. I know in my team, there is not I move that, or there are no motions, there are no changes, but that's one thing. You can go either way with those. Loosely run meetings lacking purpose or structure will frustrate people. I think if we had the chat running right now, we could say, what's the most frustrating thing you get at a meeting? There's a lot of options there. But for me, it's when it is no purpose, no structure. It comes down to preparation for sure. Now, one thing to make sure with your preparation, make sure who's going to take the notes if you do not have a secretary. And I know most components do have a secretary in regards to this. But also it shouldn't be left up to the chair to do all that work. You need to have backup. These meetings are a big thing in keeping track, and you do have to keep track of these notes from every meeting, so you do have a history. It tells the story of your group, and you need to have those to go back to and reference. And you will be revisiting those after the meeting. But again, do not leave that up to the chair.
Great, Todd. Thank you. Those are probably the two most important questions to start with. So now we're going to get down into a little bit more meat. And the question you would be asking yourself in this one is, how will I chair this meeting? If you are the chair, how will I chair this meeting? And I want you to consider a few things. First of all, consider the many things that can disrupt a meeting. It's typical now to request that you have your members or your attendees put their phones away, or at least silence the notifications on their electronic devices. According to data collected by Apple, we interact with our smartphones about 80 times a day, average. Now, if you're of the millennial generation, you may be a lot higher than 80 times a day. So keep in mind, you want to help keep them stay on track, refocus conversations, keep moving through your agenda. How would I do this? You want to try to, be polite, not call out people by name unless that's your culture. My preference, because of my training, is I choose to speak to myself in the third person. So I would say something like, the chair wishes to remind the group that we're only speaking about X, and refocus them back to that on the agenda. Another thing is bring people back to the topic before you. We've all been in meetings where people start to go down a rabbit hole, right? And you hear a little bit of side conversation, going on. So, remind people of that and keep people refocused as they move through. And what maybe you could say is, I've heard several reasons why we should be considering an alternate proposal. Does anyone wish to speak to the issue of the new policy we just talked about? So in other words, you've gotten off track, you acknowledge that as the chair, and then you say, you're going to bring them back on track by giving them a focus, and again, encourage that conversation back and forth. Another technique that you can utilize is utilizing what's called a timed agenda. And in a timed agenda, you may inform the group of, we have 10 action items. I'm going to, as your chair, allow 10 minutes per item, and very carefully kind of monitor that. I'm not saying that you're going to rush through your decisions. Simply by putting a time on them, people can be more mindful about what they are trying to say. Sometimes it may be you don't have enough time to adequately vet. And if you are the chair of the meeting, or you're the executive director or administrative assistant, or helping to get the group through the meeting, you may make the suggestion that I think this warrants more time and we'd have to postpone it to another meeting. I'll have to say, I know many of you that are on this tonight know some parliamentary procedure, and we know that erroneously that's often referred to as tabling the motion, but we don't want to get too formal here because we know that tabling is really when we kill a motion. I want you to instead think of when you're using a timed agenda or any agenda and you don't have sufficient time, you're suspending it till you can talk about it later on. So that's just a technique to keep you on track, working within an agenda. Besides working within an agenda, another technique that the chair could use is, how do you elicit participation from everyone? Of course, you want to use your best facilitation skills, but that can be a little challenging, right? So there's an interesting study that we discovered where researchers looked at two groups. And in the first group, the members followed a loose structure of a meeting, often speaking out of turn, speaking over each other, every member gaining feedback, eventually coming up with their plan. Sounds a little bit like some of my dental team meetings, unfortunately. But in the second team, the meeting was more orderly, with only those with the information reporting. Assignments were given, they came up with their plan, and they actually finished the meeting early. Now, which was the more effective meeting in terms of team production and effectiveness? Actually, it's the first group. And maybe you guys all guessed that because we're in the section on facilitation. Group discussion where everyone felt heard and participated, especially in smaller meetings, is more conducive to the goals of the meeting. You know, this isn't in conflict with what Todd said earlier, which was, you know, be prepared, have an idea of what you're saying. You simply want to make sure that if you are trying to be an effective chair and work within your agenda, you utilize facilitation techniques where everyone feels heard. So, how do we accomplish this? I'll have to say, of all the questions that you guys submitted to us ahead of time, this came up more than any other. So, to get members engaged, whether it be your team members, a small committee, a large committee, a group, a civic group, ask participants to prepare both a pro or a reasons why we want to adopt something and a con or why we don't want it. So I would call up 2 board members when I was board chair and I'd say, I want you to go out, research. I want you to give us every reason why you think the MDA should adopt this policy. And then I call up another member and say, regardless of where you would stand on this, I want you to know someone's doing the pro. I want you to do the opposite viewpoint. Anyone with high school debate knows that this is a typical format where you're eliciting, you're bringing out both sides. How does it help with facilitation? It kind of breaks that bubble a little bit and it helps other people start speaking around the table. And you actually establish that you have 2 diverse opinions out there and it helps you make a better decision. Second, establish a culture where everyone will be called upon within their comfort level. I know I sat at a meeting one time and maybe I was looking a little zoned, but the chair turned to me and said, Deb, it looks like you have something to say. Well, I came up with something to say, but from then on, and I made sure that I was paying careful enough attention so that I could respond when it was appropriate.
Well, and the one thing too, Deb, when you talk about, with your preparedness for the meeting, when you're giving people a heads up on the topics you're wanting them to ask, it's also engaging them in the topics prior to the meeting as well, which is nice because I think every one of us has been to a meeting where you might look around the room and somebody does have their eyes glazed over, whether, I don't know, they're all deep in thought, but I think that's the one part you're right on. It's like, you need to come to the meeting prepared too. So I'm going back to tip 2, sorry, but I'm prepared. But the preparedness is not only the chair, it's everyone else needs to be prepared too. Sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you. Normally, Todd and I would do this with the chat and we would be going back and forth with all of you. So we are trying to pivot here because there's so many on. So thank you, Todd. And hopefully we'll answer all of your guys' questions as we go forward. So again, helping to facilitate the conversation and a few techniques that you will use. The question also came up, what happens when a few dominate? Or maybe it's adversarial conversation. So again, since we're talking about how to be a good chair and we're being prepared and how I will chair a meeting, if you have that conversation, a few are dominating, they're going back and forth across a conversation. As the chair, one of the things to do is make sure you're maintaining that level of order or calmness and just stop and just say, now that we've heard from the 2 of you, I'm curious on the thoughts of the rest of the group. And only call on each person once. I think when Todd talked about onboarding or orientations, if you have your opportunity every year as the incoming chair to say, this is how I'm going to handle conversation, how I'm going to handle discussion, people will know going in. They'll know what to expect. Another point that you may want to consider is when you see everything is all one-sided, and just simply ask your group, now that we've explored all the reasons why it's a good idea that we adopt this motion, I'm now going to entertain any thoughts on why we should not adopt this motion. Or maybe you're in a dental team meeting and you're actually doing brainstorming. There isn't anything formal on the table, but everyone's piling on into one area. Redirect them. Help increase participation by redirecting the question to the opposite viewpoint. Again, it just brings out both viewpoints. I think, angling on what Todd said about preparation, I think as a chair, you should be aware of if there's going to be very passionate issues in front of you that you're going to have in front of the meeting, and be prepared for that. And one of my things I like to use is when I sense that there's going to be a great amount of conversation and making sure everyone has, again, that equal opportunity for participation, just start right off, right after the motion is addressed, after it's read in and seconded, just say something like, because I sense that everyone is very passionate, about this issue, I'm going to go around the table. I'm going to start at the far end, and I'm going to have Todd go first, and I'm going to give every member 3 minutes to state their opinion. And we're going to go all around before we let someone else speak again. So again, it increases that participation, and it allows people to not necessarily pile on to conversation that's already been stated and have to be a little bit more mindful. And it also, again, since we're talking about effectiveness, you've made your meeting more effective as you move through. Another technique. So again, in our facilitation, another technique is to use open-ended questions and rephrasing, to draw out ideas, to promote that rich, full dialogue that you're looking for. So again, a comment that you may make is, we've addressed the problem. Now I want you to bring forward your solutions. Thinking about what are open-ended as opposed to, more detailed can really help the members feel like they can get engaged. Most importantly, as the chair, is as you build your relationship and your trust across the organization, I think that really helps in your facilitation. But most of you only have maybe 12 months to do this, and that's a challenge. I sat down and, when I was speaker and I was speaking with a former president, actually he was a president, he was getting ready to become a former president. And, and he says, Deb, this has been a great year. He says, by the time I finally figured out what I was doing and running these meetings, my time is done. So my challenge to you is ask yourself how you're going to chair your meeting, put some preparation and thought into it. Consider all of these different techniques of increasing participation, asking questions, be prepared by having people give debate on both sides so that it's a good experience for everyone. So Nancy Klein has said, and this is one of my favorite quotes that I think we can move over into in dental, is a manager's ability to turn a meeting into a thinking environment is probably an organization's greatest asset. So those of you who are out there who are going to maybe just chair a committee meeting, think about how can I make that be a thinking environment? And when we're all engaged, that definitely happens a lot more. So one more technique for the chair. We've got everyone engaged. We've come prepared. The next thing you want to do is make sure you wrap up and you summarize the decisions. I want to say here, just avoid the statement of motion carries. Again, you've got your chair, your clerk, your secretary, someone is taking minutes, and allow them to catch up a little bit. But I heard Todd earlier say, our patients need to hear things a couple times too. So instead, when you wrap up or you summarize, take the time to say, for instance, the motion has been adopted and the executive director will now purchase a new computer. The group has just heard what they've passed. They now hear an action of what's going forward. And it gives our brains time to catch up and put it from our, what we just learned into longer term memory so that we can realize what our decisions are coming out of that meeting. Maybe it's the end of your meeting, the very end, and you're finishing up your meeting and the chair would say something like, the group we've accomplished all the business before us. The summary of our actions that we have taken will be emailed to all of you within 3 days. I want to remind the committee members that you are to turn in your report in writing 1 week prior to our next meeting, which is March 15th. So again, you take a little time to summarize, allows your person taking minutes to catch up. But I think most importantly, it allows your meeting attendees to hear things multiple times. Of course, they participated, they know what they voted on, but they want to hear the action. It will help them if they have to prepare any reports. Last 2 points for a chair, and very important, is thank everyone for their time. I think this seems obvious, but it's missed so many times. Thank them for their time. Their time is very valuable. And lastly, end on time, or better yet, end 5 minutes early. I want to say as we
That's
move
right.
into, yeah, always end early, right? As it's not enough just to be a good chair. The effectiveness of the meeting also hinges on its members and its executive team or administrative team. So Todd's going to take us into our next question on teams.
And
Thanks.
I'm gonna jump back a little bit, Deb, for what you were talking about. Folks, time is the one thing we're not making more of. I've seen and heard that so many times with it. But that is the big part. I know with the meetings that I've chaired, that Deb has chaired, it's starting on time. When you start on time and end on time, and you do your best in the throughout it with it, and really acknowledge them and thank them for being there. I think that's a big thing for me always, to do that, because everyone at those meetings is a volunteer, just like the chair and everyone else. But it's most appreciated when people are giving of their time to be a part of a group. So for me, that's a big thing. So let's go on tip number 4. Every meeting deserves good board and committee members. Folks, this is a big thing. What's the question you ask here? How do I become a better board or committee member? Well, let's talk a bit through this. First, educate yourself on both your association and or your industry. It might be something else you're looking at that you're working outside. You're in a Rotary group, you're learning more, but find out what your group is doing or what your association, your dental society, your church board, you name it, any kind of 501c3 board you're serving on with those. This is a big thing. Know what you're doing. So that means do your homework before the meeting. Know what's going on. I always chuckle when we're sitting in a meeting, and I've seen at the national level, someone ask a question that, was in the background statement, clearly stated what they just asked. So do your homework, read up. You come prepared. If everyone comes prepared, it's a whole lot easier to get through the meeting and a little bit, more fun. There we go. Hey, I remembered that one. Don't ask questions that were already answered. Be an engaged listener. Don't glaze over. Don't pick up your phone, as much as it's tempting to do that. Especially now with Zoom in those meetings, you might see that. But in person, just put them down. It's not, but be engaged and listen to everyone else's side, because they might have something that's brand new. And I had this in the meeting we had this past Friday. I was listening and listening, and you know what? My vote changed based on what somebody said. And I wanted to hear a couple answers. I asked a question, somebody brought it up, and I went from a no to a yes. And it was all because I was engaged in what they were doing. And again, back to respecting everyone's time. I know that I've sat on a board of a high school group, and I sit there, and that one person in that group for the last 2 years tends to just talk about their child instead of the whole group, and it's all focused on them. And my wife will tell you that it annoys her to no end. And I think we all might know someone like that just talks about how it impacts them. It's about the group. It's not about just them or their child. So watch and do that, but be respectful of everyone else's time. It also means you got to need a good chair to take aside and not do it in front of people, but redirect them and say, we are focused on the whole group. And yeah, no me too, or trying to restate what the last 3 people said. If 3 people just said it, you're probably going to do pretty well in getting this one passed. And that's a big thing to watch for within that, but don't restate it and keep going on. When you're a listener, though, remember that you listen to understand, not to respond. Just sit back and listen to those things. So next, we'll move on here again. So how do I become the board member? Have an open mind. It says that the I see only what the mind is prepared to comprehend. And that's from Henry Bergson. Very insightful for how we look at for having an open mind when you come into a meeting. Respect the board and the group decisions and be a full participant. You're going to speak with one voice after that meeting. It's one thing I've learned in the past years of being on the board. You know, you might have disagreements throughout it. You work it through, but in the end, it is the decision of the board and the group, and you stand behind that. And that is one part of it for speaking with one voice, as we see. You know, lead change and don't resist us. Don't resist it or us, I guess, but more so don't resist the change that's in front of you. You know, if we look back, and I know right now we're all going to see a whole lot of things popping up on our phones here, not right now, but later on, for where you were a year ago and the changes. We've had all this change. We have, luckily, I know for Michigan Dental, and it's in particular for me as the speaker, I was happy that we were already ahead of some of this in regards to Zoom meetings and allowing our groups to meet by that. People resisted that change initially, and that was 3 years ago. But I'm glad we got ahead of it because it was for the betterment of our association to have that ability. So we did not always have to drive up to Okemos for every meeting for those as well. And so that's a great thing to have there with not resisting it. But visionary leadership, it's why the change is worth pursuing. Goes back here to mentor new and prospective members. You know what? At some point, you need to look at this. When you get to a board and it's all people who've been on it for 10 years and there's no one new, it's not a welcoming environment for folks. But you want to mentor new and prospective members. You've got to be looking for who's that person. I always look and say, who's going to take over the role I'm in right now? I want to help mentor and get them ready for taking over, because at some point I am not going to do it and someone's going to need to take over within that. And, you know, for one part for me, one of the books that's behind me over my shoulder is John Maxwell's book, The Leader's Greatest Return. And knowing where you're at with mentoring individuals coming up, that's a big thing. And you will get an incredible return on that investment of time and mentoring people. And that's one, if you want to pick up a book, that Leader's Greatest Return, I can't turn and grab it fast enough. I'm not that good. I'm sure Deb has it already organized where she can grab hers right there. But that's a big thing. And last, one thing that you as a good board or committee member, challenge yourself and grow as a leader. What are you doing? You know, we always look and say, are you reading something? Or what are you learning all the time? I know for my own team and my practice, they know that when I stop having fun and I stop learning is when I'm going to be done. Each day I find something fun and I try and learn something new for what we're doing. Or when I'm going to CE, what am I bringing back to the team? But challenging yourself, in particular as a leader. Each one of you, as we look as a board member, I'm not expecting to reach over and what's in front of you. Hey, always have the AIP, be ready to go with the standard code for parliamentarians. I'm not expecting everyone on this call to go through and pick that up and take it to their next board meeting. But find a leadership book, find a Maxwell, find any of these authors or folks that Deb's been talking about as well, and pick something up and read. You will never know what that'll do for you as a leader, but as a good board member, and you're going to challenge yourself in that way. Just think a little differently. Basically, and this comes from Jack Welch, and this is incredible American entrepreneur in that. And Jack Welch, I want to make sure I get this correct. So it says, approach every meeting with a purposeful, high energy, ready to make a contribution attitude, and watch how fast leadership's perception of you follows your behavior. All right, let's move on. From every meeting has the good board and committee members to the next parts, the agenda. All right, and I just signed off on the agenda that we'll be bringing to the House this year. The agenda determines what the business is to be considered at the meeting. That comes from Canon, one of the big folks that's out there in regards to parliamentary procedures. It is the roadmap the members agree to follow from the beginning of the meeting to the end. So what's the question we're going to ask here? Big one. How do I set and work within the agenda? Well, you know, there's many changes that may occur and ways to expedite the business of the meeting. You know, within this, you have reports that can be delivered electronically and only call for comments or questions. We have this routinely at the board level. You might not have it a local component or at your church board meeting or wherever, but these could all be given to you. Does anybody have any questions on this report? Or leave that as part of the agenda where people can ask those questions. You know, the one big part is you want to grant the chair the ability to move agenda items around in sequence to better facilitate the business of the group. You know, they might go through and the chair being able to do this helps because you can look and say, I see where this might be a sticky point. So you might put that one further down. As Deb talked earlier, having a timed agenda. You know, if there's ways to manage this, and I know I've seen it where within a meeting with a difficult conversation you think will be a sticky wicket, You might say, I want to have 3 people talk on the pro side, 3 on the con side. You're given 2 minutes each to go through. We'll go alternate pro con. And that's a great way to go through and keep that moving in the agenda, because the whole goal is that you're facilitating the work of the group within there. And sometimes if it hasn't been already done prior to that meeting, you might say if there's no objection, the chair will reorder the agenda to accommodate maybe the guest who's come in. So you might bring that up. You might have already within your rules to go through and reorder the agenda to allow a report to be heard. You can make those adjustments within the agenda ahead of time is always best because of preparation, but sometimes you get in a meeting, you might need to make a change. Someone has to leave at a certain time or someone's arriving and you're running behind. So you got to watch for those. You know what? One part too within your agenda, maybe tuck in a little bit of time in there. That's for team building or board governance, areas that you need to look at or work on. This is one big part for within the MDA board is that we're going through and fulfilling visionary leadership. We do this routinely as part of our board meetings, where we have topics that we will watch a video on, have discussion, read articles, have a discussion. It's not necessarily something that we are doing that day, but it's something that we'll build to the future. And that's where a lot of great ideas come from within our board for where we're going in the future. But it falls to board governance and education. Deb.
One of my favorite techniques of working with an agenda is using something that I've named the parking lot. So the parking lot is for when you're working within your agenda and you're on a topic, or maybe you're actually on a main motion and you start to hear people kind of go off to one side. That's usually when, as chair, I will put it in a parking lot. Or if I'm a member, I'll suggest that we put it in a parking lot. Really, all that is allows us to set aside that conversation on that topic, and we'll finish what we're doing. And at an appropriate time, we're going to take it out of the parking lot, maybe drive it around a little bit more, see does it warrant further discussion. Sometimes the further discussion is we don't really have time to vet this fully tonight at the meeting, but we're going to assign it to a committee because we feel it's valuable. Thank you for your feedback. And we'll have a committee report on it. I use the parking lot all the time in my dental team meetings. It's a smaller group. We tend to sometimes when we're brainstorming, we'll get a little off topic and we'll just call parking lot, stick it in the parking lot. Later, I'll have to remember it's there and we'll pull it off and come back to utilize that again. So without being too formal, and some of you may know, you can certainly make a motion to postpone that later, but this parking lot concept, I just want you to remember to have that as you're listening to people talk, something else may come up. And so rather than letting people take your agenda down a rabbit hole where you don't really want it to go, just say, we're going to set that aside for right now. And perhaps during new business, you may put all that business, bring it back again and remember to bring it back again. But if you can keep that vision or that picture of the parking lot, that can be very helpful for helping you work within an agenda. So I hope that helps.
Deb, I'm happy you brought that up because I had 2 team members said, let's take this out in the parking lot one time. It had nothing to do with anything like that. They were teasing. Sometimes they threatened to take somebody out in the parking lot, but I like your parking lot. It's a lot nicer.
Remember, be nice.
Yeah.
When you're running a meeting, be nice.
Yes, be nice. All right.
So we've dealt probably with the meat of how to make a meeting most effective. The questions that you're going to ask yourself, do I need to have a meeting? Do I have enough material? Am I prepared for it? How will I chair it? How can I be a better member? And how have I set up my agenda? So, real briefly, I'm just going to go into some, I guess, what we title formality. But the question that I think we'd ask ourselves here is, how do I utilize the best principles of parliamentary procedure? Don't want to turn you all into parliamentarians. I'm not asking you, as Todd said, we're not asking you to read AIP, but there's a few basic things that no matter what type of meeting, no matter the size of the group, no matter what you're doing that you'll want to follow. So the first is usually the larger the group, the more formal. When Todd and I would, chair meetings of the House of Delegates, you have a couple hundred people, definitely you have to be much more formal. When I'm in a small committee of 5 people, it's not quite so formal. We may not even be throwing up motions. So the size of your group definitely can help dictate the formality. When I took my first training through AAP and I went off, my team knew I was going. And so our very next meeting, when I came back, and it made me laugh because they opened the meeting with a formal motion and they attempted to speak in that. So I appreciated the attempts. But again, the formality, you never want that to get in the way um, of your meeting. You want your group to feel at ease. But the basic principle is no matter what you're doing, you only want to talk about one thing at a time or one main motion at a time. So that's a great way to, maintain your order as well. Secondly, when you're looking at formal, so we're only talking about one thing. The next principle is require those who want to speak to be recognized. So that may be, you raise your hand in your group. It may be you have someone else is keeping a list. And so everyone who wants to speak on something will quickly raise their hand and their names will go down. And as you go forward, I'll call on Todd. And then after Todd, we'll listen to Michelle, or after Michelle. So you kind of keep a running order. You may have, and you'll see this, definitely like in school board meetings, people need to rise to speak, or they'll go up and approach a microphone in a more formal setting. Whatever your culture is, make sure that if you were trying to speak, you don't speak until the chair has called your name or recognized you or said the member at the microphone. When people tend to talk over each other and go back and forth, that's when things tend to break down. So keep that in mind. And I think one of the best things to remember is maybe get this clear from the very beginning of how you are going to recognize members of your group. If you do an orientation, it can be very confusing to a new member if they don't know when they should speak. So go over that as part of your orientation.
And hey, Deb, that's one part I know that we worked on last year within the board, because when we switched over in our board meetings as of last March, we're all by Zoom. It was real
Yeah.
tenuous at first because, obviously if you're doing Zoom, you have where they can raise hand or different things, or people actually literally are raising their hand. But when you have a group, if it's a smaller group, like Deb said, an intimate group of 5 or 6, everyone's on the Brady Bunch squares. But when you get a bigger group, it expands that out. So if there are 18 or 20, you're not going to see everyone. So I know one thing we did as a trick, or not a trick, but as Deb said, what's your culture? That's when you have the comments going on the side and somebody will write comment, or some might say point of order, but comment's the one part. So that way that helps the chair or the person assisting the chair to know who's next. And within a few meetings, everyone got the hang of it. But if you start that at the meeting, and especially right now, while many groups are still meeting virtually, that's one great way to make sure everyone's voice can be heard. But that way they know, hey, who's up next? And people are very good at pointing out if somebody might have jumped ahead, especially if you're saying, oh no, Deb was first, or that's one way to do it. But that's one big part I know as well, since we don't always have that in person where you can see someone raise their hand at a board meeting and somebody's writing down who's next. But in the Zoom world, that's one way to do it. So thanks, Deb. Back to you.
Great. Thanks, Todd, for putting that in there. And, we are going to deal a little bit more with virtual meetings, but it's so appropriate here under formality and addressing, because it comes up all the time. And I get equally frustrated when I sit on meetings and I don't know what I'm supposed to do. How am I supposed to get my comment heard? Equally important, remember that just because someone desires to speak, they may not be recognized. And that's based on your chair, that's based on what you're meeting there to do. My suggestion is let the group know ahead of time. Maybe it's a public meeting. You're running a public meeting. You don't have time for public comment at the onset. Tell the group. As the board is going about its business and listening to committee reports, we do not have time for public comment. If time opens up at the end of the agenda, I'll address, the public's comments at that time. So again, it's a way of recognizing people and letting them know, where they stand. Another part of, depending on how formal you want to be, but can be discouraging, that breaks down meeting effectiveness, is discourage that banter back and forth between members. And it can happen just real easily. People get excited, they get engaged in a conversation, and rather than directing it to the whole group, they just start having their conversation across the board table. Again, you can take this very politely, just in remind and not calling out any one particular member, but you can just say, I want to remind the board that every comment is to be considered. So please refrain from immediately commenting without being recognized. So again, back to that concept of being recognized. Maybe you're a member and you're getting frustrated. You say, point of order, Madam Chair. I cannot hear because there's so much talking going on in the background. So again, I hesitate to call banter, discouraging back and forth formality, but I just think it's one of those things that can make your meeting less effective. And so be aware of it. And it doesn't matter if you're the chair, a member, or if you're assisting the chair. Everyone should be able to have that ability to politely remind people to not banter back and forth. Probably the most important thing is, remember that parliamentary procedures should never be used as a tool to confuse members or restrict their access to discussion. I've seen this happen. I think sometimes people feel like it's happened to them. So try to explain things as you go along. Try to, if someone isn't understanding a process, because it may seem a little formal, take the time to explain it. If you're a member, take the time to learn it too. I mean, as Todd said in his earlier comments, some of it is on you to be a good member. I'll have to say that my least favorite rule that I see overutilized in formality is the through the chair comments. And what I mean by that is you'll have a speaker, there'll be some conversations, and right away people, especially when we're live, they'll say, Mr. President, through the chair, I have a question for our presenter, and there is no pause, there is no recognition. And then the next person piles on through the chair. And, without boring you with the parliamentary reason of why we do that, I see people's eyes glaze over. I see them go, what's this? Aren't we just having a conversation? So again, don't let things become too formal because, you've seen it on a show on TV or you've watched something. Make sure that everyone feels comfortable with your process by explaining things. To my point on through the chair, when you had all of your comments are directed to your chair. The more formal, like the House of Delegates, they're going to go to the person chairing the meeting. Your committee with 5 people, you may need to be a little bit more relaxed. I've seen this still happen in small committees where people will use this, especially at a national level. And it just tends to confuse people. And I call it out here for what I find can be a very confusing rule. And, just want to instruct us, I think we can do better. But my last point under formality, your best principles of parliamentary procedure always focus on the 3 C's: courtesy, communication, and common sense. And I think if we could remember those, everything else can generally fall in place very nicely.
Terrific. I know nothing wrong with courtesy, communication, and common sense in anything in life. Within those, communication is the key. But let's move on to virtual meetings, as I kind of alluded to a little bit earlier when Deb was speaking on those spots. One thing we look at is with preparations for these, because as Benjamin Franklin gave us, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail within there. So what's the question that we're going to have here in regards to virtual meetings? How do virtual meeting formats differ? Well, one of the big things is be prepared by opening up the meeting early. That's why tonight, Deb and I were on here at 6:30. Shauna made sure that we were going to be well behaved. We'd follow what she told us. She said, this is what I expect of you two, and all the way through. But we want to make sure you open that up early. Do not be waiting 5 minutes after. I've been on calls that were not MDA. I was doing some other ones, and they have everyone kind of in a holding pattern waiting. Nobody likes to wait in person. You shouldn't have to wait virtually. Be prepared and get it going. Hey, wait, preparation. We're going back to that one again. Wow. Within there. Check the technology prior to the meeting. Start to encourage early logons. Obviously for us, we want to make sure that our slideshow is working. Is that correct? Yes, you know what? I did make modifications 15 minutes before as I clicked a slide. And then you have people like Deb. You look down there and we all have seen that a poor attorney that turned out like that. Oh, And now she's back. Oh, good. I was wondering. I thought she was trying out for the new Wonder Woman movie within that. So, but you know, you've got all that stuff going on, but check the slides. Watch for strange cat filters like that, people. Don't do that. I am not that talented, but other people are as well. Have good lighting and audio. If you know, for me, for when I had to do the House of Delegates last year virtually, I had my larger mounts, but that was a little bit more formal within there. Have good lighting. Hit you from the front, not from the back. You don't be in the witness protection plan for those. Have it so people can see you. Now, the main challenge is engagement. You know, the decision is like for this, we were going to get started. Do you play, and it decides you mean, do you play music at the start? You can do that. Now, some might say, is it a dance party at that point when you're playing the music? I don't know. You know, you could have an icebreaker as part of that meeting. I know one of the new things we did for the board this year, because this year's MDA board was fully virtual. We'll never have met in person with those. And so to that end, our governance manager, Michelle Nichols-Cruz, and our executive director, Ms. Karen Burgess, they put together a list of questions that everyone had to answer. And you found out those, and what they did is a poll. Everyone submitted their answers. And then as part of the icebreaker we had prior to our meeting on the last couple of Thursday nights that we had prior to a board meeting, it was a guess who does this or guess who this is. And they put up 4, and you had to guess which one of the board members that was, you know, who had done that. You know, sometimes they'll go through and they might play an arm's length show and tell, you know, for what your hat, or, you know, like for me, what I go through and say, hey, this is why do I enjoy Deadpool? But it's what's more important about Deadpool? It's the turkey. This is the one part of my family that I get to have something that's Thanksgiving with the turkey, with those. Of course, Deb has a gavel. Of course, Deb, you know, you show off. She has the cool gavels with those, but you know, you find those things. I've seen it where we've gone through and you had it where send out group snacks. You know, conference bling. I know I've seen it where they want to make sure you stay awake. Somebody sent out coffee as well. By the way, I have never had a cup of coffee, but to our person who sent me this, I'm going to drink a cup of coffee from this for sure. It will be my first. So to our president, Steve Morella, thank you. So I'm going to be trying that. But as well, you might see stuff that's coming up from the conference that you're going to. But make sure to time to check in on your audience while you're speaking, so you won't have. That's the challenge of all this, is not having visual clues. Like, I don't know who's asleep right now. I'm sure some of you might be nodding off, your eyes glazing over. I don't know what you're doing and I can't see you. And sometimes that's not a bad thing. You know, the one part is you want to develop that protocol for members to engage in the debate and ask questions. So whether you use, as we told you tonight, the Q&A, or if you have the comment section on the side for how you're doing it. Your meeting, you want to decide is, are you going to allow for them to have private chats going on in that meeting as well? That's another part that you've got to go for. The big thing is you either use the chat or you don't, but you want to be consistent. In a smaller group, it's a lot easier. For our local board, you know, that's easier to have the chat going in that way. When it comes to with the House of Delegates with 150, 170 people on it, it makes it more challenging. And so we're finding different ways to use that for for how we utilize the chat. All right, establish the expectations for cameras on or off. Now, besides the cat people who show up with that showing up on there, you know what? You got to decide, are we going to have it on or off? Smaller groups that you've never met, it might be good. I know in the business world now, I know from my friends with Whirlpool or those, most of their meetings are camera off. But decide, if it's a monthly meeting, you know what? I would expect that most in a smaller group will have that. But have that decision. You know, I've had my wife ask me, why don't you just take that? We'll sit outside and you can just watch what's going on. Well, for me, we're sitting always at this spot. You always see the same thing behind me. It's rare that I'm not at this spot doing that for those meetings. You know, as a participant, be aware of distractions or virtual backgrounds. I don't know about you all. There she goes again. But with the virtual backgrounds, and I know we have some folks, and they seem to fade in and out of the background sometimes. It is distracting when you do that, although that was a very nice one. I tried to, folks, I tried to have it so I could have a virtual background, but I am not that talented. I use a different camera. I wanted to have the Millennium Falcon. I wanted that cockpit, but you know what? I'm just not that cool. And so I'm saying no one gets to use a virtual background if I can't have my Millennium Falcon. So, you know, this is, again, be appropriate with side chats and text messages. I don't know if you've been in a meeting when somebody thought they were going through and sending a private message in Zoom and it went to the whole group. Be a little careful with that. That's why. But those side chats do go on. Now, that being said, I know that in meetings I've been a part of that, we had text messages that were going through that actually were about the topic, but how could we move the meeting along? And I have done those, and it was about the topic. It wasn't, hey, are you going out for dinner tonight? Or, well, maybe that wasn't a question in the past year. It could be something else, but those are one things. But be appropriate when you're going through and texting during those meetings. So let's move on. Deb.
Great tips, Todd. I mean, virtual meetings are just I think they're here to stay. And, according to your survey, more than 50% of you said, yes, we're going to continue virtual meetings through this year. And, I think they definitely will have a place going forward, even when we don't have to hold virtual meetings as mandated. So 2 more tips. So hang with us here, guys. These last 2 are pretty quick, but also really important for effectiveness. And the next tip is on follow-up. And the question you're going to ask yourself here on this one is, how do I establish a meeting recap? We already talked about you have someone take minutes. So minutes are usually, according to industry standards, should be completed and sent out within a few days up to 1 week. Obviously, your board rules or your committee rules will make a difference on that. One of the techniques that can make things more effective for adopting minutes is adopt them online, adopt them virtually. So you send out your minutes with a form. Does everyone, if there's any amendments to the minutes, and adopt them electronically, which can make your next meeting more effective. However, most of the meetings that I have attended outside of dentistry don't do that. And the minutes are usually just dispersed right before the meeting. We even try in my own team meetings, we try to get our meetings out within a week, but we don't really summarize and go over those until our very next meeting. So if they're not going to come out until you walk into your next meeting or a day before, then I do suggest that either your chair, your executive director, maybe you're chairing the committee, send out a summary afterwards. I mean, this is typically done in the business world. When we looked up different things on HBR, they all said, definitely, the chair would send out a quick email summary, and that really just helps get everyone on page of what they should be doing. And it also kind of develops your to-do list. So it's just a good habit to get into. Lastly, never let the quote that Captain James Kirk said of meetings. And he said, a meeting is an event where minutes are taken and hours wasted.
James Tiberius Kirk, so wise on meetings in so many other ways. All right, folks, what happens when there's a disagreement? You know what? I fall to one of the great scholars and thinkers in this world, Patrick Swayze, in his role as Dalton in Roadhouse. Folks, be nice. Be nice at that meeting. Now, I won't go to the next part well, maybe I could, until there's a time to not be nice, but we're always going to be nice at a meeting, all right? So, how do I handle the business when consensus cannot be reached? Sometimes we just can't all figure it out. So there's 4 solid options to the situation if you have a disagreement in a meeting, and I don't mean fisticuffs. I mean, you just can't figure it out. First, you can refer this to a smaller group or an individual to investigate and report back. Hey, before our next meeting, let's have you get together and talk about this, or figure out a plan and bring us a solution or a few solutions that the group can come up with. Postpone it to later in the meeting after more data has been collected. It's sort of a not all the way to the parking lot yet, but this is kind of what you're doing. You're going to bring it back. Say, all right, let's see here if we can get it done. For shorter meetings, it's harder to do that, but for a longer one, that could be something that you work on. Postpone to a later meeting and place it under unfinished business. So this might be where you're going to postpone it definitely to the next meeting to be brought back and discussed as well. Or last, defeat it. You can always bring it back at a future meeting. That's one other way to do this too.
All right. So even though you have disagreement and you've figured out how to handle it, sometimes there are meeting pitfalls. So the question you would ask yourself here is, how do we overcome meeting pitfalls? And this came up a little bit on some of your pre-surveys as well. And I just want to begin just with a quote that we found, which is, smooth seas do not make skillful sailors. Smooth seas do not make skillful sailors. Not everything is going to go perfectly, ladies and gentlemen. We all know that. And we all, I think, are advanced enough to know that, we learn from these things. but it does kind of hit you a little bit in your gut. So what are some things that you can use to overcome some of those? The first is a technique that's often used in larger groups and in legislatures, particularly, and that is calling for a motion to recess. This could be in a variety of ways. Maybe the conversation is getting very heated, it's maybe going nowhere. So the chair just calls for a 10-minute recess. Maybe as the members, you see people starting to get disengaged. So you call for a recess, people step outside, grab a cup of coffee, biology break, whatever, and they come back in more focused. Great technique to be able to use. Some of you that are participating here tonight will remember the very poignant recess that was called, and it always sticks with me as my very first House of Delegates, because we were in the middle of, I wouldn't say it was a challenging debate, but it was definitely engaged. There was definitely two polar sides of it. And there was a definite storm brewing within our House of Delegates. I also didn't know, because we're in an enclosed room with no windows to the outside, there happened to be a very big storm brewing on the outside in Lansing, Michigan as well. And just when a motion was made and I heard a collective groan and sigh, all of a sudden there was a crack of lightning and we lost all power in the auditorium. Everything went down. To me, it felt like, minutes. I think it was probably only seconds, but everything quickly came back up. But as you know, when all your computers go down and you're in a large auditorium, it takes a while for things to reset. So recess was called, making a little humor out of it. I think I looked up for some divine intervention. Everyone lightened a little bit. Whatever the debate they were in, it kind of caused a collective sigh. It caused people to regroup. The group came back very quickly after that, defeated the motion, went on to handle the main business in front of them, and they finished in a matter of minutes. I did not see that happening before the lightning strike. I don't propose you have a lightning strike, but I just make the point of sometimes recesses can happen at a perfect opportunity just to get your group back in focus. The next thing that you can use is postpone definitely. In other words, you're in a meeting, it's just not going well. You can make the motion to postpone the business to a certain time, which is postpone definitely. Madam President, I move that we postpone agenda item number 5 until our next business meeting when our executive director can bring us more background information, something like that. So postponing it definitely and putting a time frame on it is a way to kind of overcome that pitfall of you're going down, a road that you don't want to go down. We talked about this earlier underneath the ability of the chair, but anticipate debate. Anticipate debate and assign members to bring out both sides of the discussion. And I bring it up here again under pitfalls because it's a great way to avoid a pitfall. But if you anticipate you're going to have a lot of debate, make sure that you thought that ahead and assigned it out. And then, lastly, make good meeting management a habit. When you make it a habit and you follow all the principles of, am I prepared? How am I going to chair the meeting? How formal am I going to be? How am I engaging people? That everyone will appreciate and you'll have much better results. Always end your meeting on a positive note. I learned this when I traveled out to a meeting on governance before I became chair of the MDA board. And what we started to do on our board was end every meeting with, give me your rose or your rosebud. Your rose, what was something that you really, really liked about the meeting? Your rose, what's your rosebud? What's something you're looking forward? Quite frankly, I think I stole it from Boy Scouts because they do rose, rosebud, thorn. We don't do thorns because thorns are in your follow-up again. They always recommend we want to end on a positive. I've also seen people end their meetings with, after they finish all their business, what do we want to do more of or what do we want to do less of? But my personal favorite is, what did you like? What did you learn? And what would you do differently? So when I'm meeting with my dental team, particularly when we do like a half-day seminar together, when we came back from COVID, for instance, we met for like 7 days. Some of those were videos that we watched and we did a whole kind of agenda. The very end, I always ask, and they know, I think they know to anticipate it. What did you like? What did you learn? And what will you do differently? So you just get through a full day meeting or maybe a 3-hour meeting. You wanna go away, remember, with some of that recall. And that's a great way to do it. And it's also a great way to end your meeting on a high or on a positive note. And lastly, follow-up surveys and willingness to accept any criticism or critiques, I would say is a better word, and also to deliver praise. People like to know that they did well on a certain aspect of the meeting. You can always see a progress as people move forward, as they get more comfortable in their roles. So while a lot of meeting pitfalls are the fact that things can just happen and you can utilize any of these techniques, I think a lot of it, again, points back to preparation and realizing that, you know what, things are going to happen. Let them happen. It's not the end of the world. When everything seems to be going against you, remember that the airplane takes off against the wind, not with it. And I quote Henry Ford. So anticipation is the best way to avoid pitfalls. I think you heard me say I tend to use a little humor. You heard Todd say, be nice, be kind, be helpful. It's never the end of the world. And ask yourself all of these questions. What are the meeting objectives? How have I prepared? How will I chair? How do I be a better member? Do I know how to work within an agenda? Do I have a basic knowledge of parliamentary procedure? Have I anticipated how a virtual meeting is different? How will I follow up? How will I handle disagreement? And how do I avoid meeting pitfalls? Those are our 10 questions. Oh, but wait, there's a bit more. Todd?
Yeah, there are. We've got more resources here to help you with your next meeting and some areas that we've found both in here. So let's see, what do I need more of? And now what, after you've been sitting through all of this with Deb and I here tonight? So this is one that when I went to my first AIP, which is American Institute of Parliamentarians, the folks who wrote the book, Meeting Pitfall there, hold your book correctly. But within there, a great meeting really does have a lot of essays that are in there called snippets. So if you go to agreatmeeting.com, go through and look for the snippet side, and addresses a variety of motions with meetings. Now within here, this is one that you can go through. There's ebooks that they have as well within there, but the snippets have been a really good thing. And I've actually used those for training as backgrounds, just to give ideas on how to look at a topic differently when it comes to a parliamentary procedure. But this is one that, take a look at agreatmeeting.com. And that would be one way to start from, and find something you might be. This could be one of your education parts that you do within your board. And that's a good way to look at it. We've got the next ones as well that are out there is Magic Gavel. This is a mobile app that helps you go through and provide motion and wording and rules and answers as well to common parliamentary procedure questions. So there it is right there. Next, Canon's Concise Guides to Rules of Order. Now, this is one, it's way up on the shelf right now. I forgot to grab it ahead of time, but this is one that really will help out. It's an easy read. Hugh Canon, who wrote this, really wrote the book back through the 70s into the 80s. It is one of those parliamentary Bible type ones that goes either way, whether it is with the standard code from the American Institute of Parliamentarians or even Robert's Rules, and he looks at it both ways. But it's a really great reference book as well. Great chart in the front that goes through the 12 basic motions and how you go through and do things. Now let's move on to the next part. As I said, the standard code. This is one, all right. So you'll see that one written there, standard code. It is available in digital format as well. It is through the AIPparl.org. The standard code is the parliamentary authority for the American and the Michigan Dental Associations. This is what we follow. It is more straightforward. Everyone who claims and says, well, Robert's Rules, they never read it. Have you? That book is that thick. It was written way back. I'm sorry, that is so old school. the standard code, when I've had the talks, and in this year I was lucky enough to have 4 other dentists that joined me to go virtually to the AIP, to our annual meeting. And they started seeing how more straightforward, because they saw presentations on Robert's rules and on AIP, and started to see why it's more straightforward. It is easier to work with, I think, within groups like ours. A lot less formal, but it does have a formality, as Deb talked about, but it's more simple and it makes sense, and that's what we need. The AIP, this is the organization. You can go through and take a look on there. They do have information regarding the organization. I don't think you all need to join it. You could, you'll get their newsletters, but more so there's some good resources there on their website. But the standard code, I've ordered mine, and there's a new one that is going to be coming out here in the coming year, that they're getting ready with the rewrites and the updates to it. And then let's get to the last part as well. Oh yes, and on the standard code as well, you can get a digital. I know Deb works from a digital format a lot when she does. I have it handheld. We both have it both ways. I have 2 or 3 copies of the old version, and then the new version too. But anytime, you can call us, email us. Email us first is probably the easiest way. But if you want to have a deep parliamentary discussion and chat, we're always all in. That parliamentary nerds unite. It's almost like the Wonder Twins in Super Friends. But there's a lot more folks that are doing this, that are out there. And if you have a question, call us. I know I've had components that have reached out to me in the last year saying, I've got this challenge, what should we do? Before a meeting, I'll meet with a chair and just check in and say, hey, here's where I see a challenge coming up. What do you see and how can I help you? And if you've got a challenging topic, I'm available. Deb is available to help you out with that as well. But you'll have our email here coming up. Shauna is going to take over here, I believe.
Actually, I think we have a few questions I just want to address really quickly. So I think one of them is more of a helpful hint, and it comes from our executive director, Karen Burgess, and just reminding the group that Doodle Poll is a specific tool that you can use for helping people decide on the best date or time. And she typed it in here in our Q&A. It's at doodle.com. So way back to the very beginning when we were going over, informing people about a meeting, how to remind people about a meeting, utilizing Doodle Poll is a great way. Within my small group, I'll have to say within my team, I just work through my Google Calendar and I send everyone invites that way because there's only a few. There's another question, and it pertains to when we were talking about debate. And the question comes, when should you limit debate, and does it have to be stated in the beginning? So keep in mind that, when a motion to limit debate is taking some of the freedom away from the assembly. So that actual motion in parliamentary procedure is, going to take a 2/3 vote if it comes up. But when we presented the technique of how to be an effective chair, it wasn't so much as prohibiting people from having debate. It was putting limitations on at the very beginning. I'm going to give every person, 3 minutes. And it's generally done by, universal or consent. If a member doesn't agree to that, it's, their right to stand up. I don't agree to this. I want to go back to our original rules. So yes, I would say that you would want to state that in the beginning, but say you're a member and you want to have an effective meeting and you hear the group going down a rabbit hole, as I like to say, and you want to focus that, you can still, make a motion in that meeting because it would be in order to limit debate halfway through. Granted, it takes a vote to move into that. But if you're trying to just be the most effective from a chair position, I would handle that on the front end. Do you have anything different you want to add, Todd?
You know what, Deb, and that's exactly when I said that earlier, it is one that we've had here recently as that part of it, where we knew there was a contentious area that was coming up, in the best way in talking with the chair, I said, I'd recommend we look at doing it this way and start on the outset, and say, I want to hear both sides. We're going to read the resolution in, and then I want to hear both sides. Or I think the group wants to hear both sides and let those people speak. That way it does guarantee the right of both sides of the debate to go here and hear the other side, and allows those who might not have made a decision yet to hear both sides. So it goes back to your recommendation sometimes, and when you'd ask somebody to speak to the pro or the con, and you hear those. I think the big thing is it allows them, this will sound, it's more parliamentary, it allows the minority voice to be heard, but you don't know which one the minority voice is until the vote has been taken. in regards to that. And I think that's a really good way to do it. I would prefer to have it on the outset. I think we've both seen this more times. It's always best if somebody gives a heads up to the chair that they'd like to look at that, because then the chair can be prepared. You don't want to surprise a chair, people. Don't run in and throw some parliamentary slap down on them at a meeting and surprise them, and then they're not sure. Not everybody is trained to do all that. Not everybody's heard all that. And that's where, like Deb said earlier, don't use parliamentary policy. Don't use it to trick and bother people, because that's what it's going to do, and that's going to breed dissension and mistrust. But if everyone knows what they're voting on and why, it's a good thing.
Great, thank you.
And now I can see the Q&A, Deb. I'm excited.
Now you can see the Q&A.
Yeah, I finally get to.
Actually, it didn't pop up when I clicked it till the end, so no worries. So we apologize to the three of you who put questions up, but we'll get you all now. So as I read the next one,
questions, put them in.
Yeah, go ahead and put them in. We do have we have about 12 more minutes. What if the dominating speaker states so-called facts that are not able to be validated? How do you handle the information before it sways opinion? So taken from the position, this can be taken from the position of the chair or position of the member listening. And I think there's two different techniques to utilize this. Certainly there is nothing, when someone stands up to give testimony, it's their testimony. And, someone can debate that by calling that out as a member rising up, in opposition, and again, you're never ever giving testimony or debate on a person. You're always on a topic. So, if you're a member and you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, you could quickly ask to be recognized and then very simply say, while I hear the speaker speaking as factual, I'm not confident that those can be validated. And then you could ask it be validated. You always have your right to have your questions answered. But by just putting that out there to the group, that may cause enough of, well, wait a minute, we need to continue to look at this. If you're the chair, it's also, you're there to facilitate. You're never there to dominate, and you're always there to facilitate the business of the group. But as the chair, sometimes you may not have a group or a body who will know all of those things. And if you know something that comes forward, you can do the exact same thing. The person gives their testimony. It's either for or against. You restate giving testimony for, and you can quite simply say, as your chair, I heard many questions come forward. I'm going to turn to our treasurer now and see if we can validate any of those statements. Hopefully that helps, with the question that came up. Todd, do you have anything else to ask? Those are the first two things that came to my mind.
No, and that's why, because I know for mine, I've not seen that where I've heard anybody bringing up facts that, are not able to be validated. However, I think you're right on in saying, could we get some assistance from, I think we've seen it a couple of times where somebody made a statement at a large meeting and there's murmur, where people didn't believe that was the fact. And they said, would they go through, could we get an answer, like you said, from the treasurer, from the executive director, so we can hear where the statement is coming from? Because something, information can be misinterpreted. And that's why. And I think that's always best. But remember, as Deb said, and I said earlier, be nice. It's not about the person, it's about the information. You do not want to make it where you call somebody out individually. You don't do that. You do need to be nice within that. I think that's the best way forward, and people will see it. But if you ask that question, could I get some more information regarding this, because I've not heard that information before. I've not heard that before. I think that's a good way to manage it. It's nice. You're being nice as well. So
quite frankly, you're benefiting the whole group too. There's never good decisions should be made on bad information. So you're benefiting the whole group by calling that out. And I think that's courageous, and I think that's ethical as well.
Mhm.
So I don't see any other questions popping in into the Q&A. I want to thank all of you guys for attending this. I mean, this came out of, a request by people filling out a survey, and Todd and I saw it. And we're like, yeah, we want to do this. So thank you for attending. I know that some of you were looking for a variety of different points based on your survey questions. Hopefully we answered most of those. Definitely we were trying to direct this towards the objective, which was support for leadership components. Hey, thanks Natalie for the shout out in the Q&A. Appreciate that. But you know what, as Todd said, we're always here for you. Todd and I, we have conversations. I don't know, do we go more than a few days? We'll have conversations back and forth on some of these topics, that are, so feel free to reach out to us. Our emails are actually in the follow-up that you guys will be getting, or you can always look us up. So anyways, and to all of you, we've already had requests, because I said, sometimes you don't know what you're doing until you're there. To all of you who are moving into a chair position, we would very much like to handle like a small group and just do some practice. That's how Todd and I learned. That's how a lot of our chairs learned, as we go through role play. That's how my team learns, that's how my team learns different strategies of dealing with things. So something we're already thinking and batting around. So if it's something you're really interested in and you like more of, let us know in your follow-up. So
yeah, that's one part I know that I've done as the last few years following in Deb's footsteps, where when we would have an in-person training for getting ready for the House on the Wednesday night before, is work through the process, get used to saying how you would do motions or how you would chair. It goes back to what all of us, whether in dental school, dental hygiene school, or tell, show, do. We want to go through, we'll tell you how to do it, we'll show you how to do it, and then you get to do it. And I think the nice thing is, from the questions you all provided to us, it gave us some insight, whether we answered them tonight, but it might be something we do going forward. And I want to thank you all, and Deb and Sean and everyone else for helping us out to bring this information to you tonight.